I'm going to record it. I'm going to record it. It's not feeling great. Okay. So anyway, I think I recorded it. At least I tried. So, all right. Point A, we start with total wealth. We have no losses, no medical losses, nothing. All right. And that's why we're all the way at the top of our of this x-axis here. Okay, and now let's say we incurred the full financial loss of whatever. So for Gary, that was like $1,000. Then we're down here, W minus loss. That's the lowest we might go. And some point in between that would be the actual, like the average remaining wealth, or just total wealth minus that expected loss, right? So your utility after the average loss, that's point C along that utility curve. However, the utility of that uncertain position is not as high as it would have been if we had that amount of money with certainty. So in reality, once we, factor in the uncertainty, even though we have the same expected wealth, the utility is lower. So that's why point D is lower than point C. Even though they're at the same point on the x-axis, they're at a different point on the y-axis because the utility with certainty is greater than the utility with uncertainty. Okay, it's just a way of illustrating that relationship. Right, so the key result here is simply that point C is greater than point D. And it's largely driven by the fact that this utility is curved in the relationship between wealth and utility. All right, so any questions?
I guess I just don't understand that last one.
Okay, so if you had to get, well, all right. So C, the point at C is, if you follow it over here to the y-axis, utility with certainty. Risk-averse consumers in general, especially when it comes to potential losses, prefer certainty. And utility represents consumer well-being. Right? So the well-being of that risk-averse consumer, even though it's an actuarially fair bet, the one that has certainty is going to have a higher utility value up here. So that's why C with certainty, utility with certainties, as it's measured on the y-axis, is higher. So the same actuarially fair bet is why they're both at the same point on the x-axis, right? So the wealth, in terms of dollars, there are the same dollars, like the 100% 30 or 50% of 60. It's the same average wealth. It's just that one has certainty, and so the utility of certainty is higher. Yes. Yeah, it's driven by that preference for certainty. That's why falling down is just has a huge utility loss associated with it. It's like, yeah. I just want to make sure it is. Yeah, it is recording. Okay, good. Yay. All right. So basically, yeah, because now we're going to have another little wrinkle. But the point here is just simply to say C is greater than D because we prefer certainty, even at the same actuarial bet. All right. So now we have this new point, which is lower down on the wealth axis, but equal on the utility axis. So that's a point that we haven't discussed yet. But it's basically, it represents a person's willingness to pay for insurance. And the reason it represents that is because like an amount of money that you could have with certainty could be lower than the average value with uncertainty, but because you prefer certainty, could provide more utility, you know, or at the very least, an equal amount of utility. And so you're kind of like, well, if I have to pick between the two, you know, a little bit more money, but there's a lot of uncertainty involved, or I can take a little bit less, but I'll have it for sure. You know, I think I would prefer that, or at the very least, I'm, you know, kind of indifferent between the two. That's what this point represents. A little bit less money, but no less utility because you get to have it with certainty. That's how a consumer makes a trade-off and decides, all right, well, I'm willing to pay this amount of money to end up with a little bit less dollars, but I get those less dollars with certainty. So in terms of my utility, that's a fair trade-off and I'll make it and I'm gonna make that purchase, right? So point E, we have less wealth, but not less utility. So that's your demand for insurance. That's your willingness to pay for insurance. Finally, the difference between those two things is your risk premium. So the difference between your average loss and your total willingness to pay, right? Because the only difference between the total willingness to pay and the average loss has to do with a person's trade-off and risk, you know? So over and above the average loss, the additional wealth that you're willing to lose and still be, you know, willing to pay, even with that same, you know, because it gives you the same level of utility, the difference between those two things is what represents the risk premium. Okay, questions?
So for point E, the reason you have less wealth is because you're paying for that premium, right? So then you have less wealth, but that's also why your utility is higher. Because you have like that certainty.
Well, your utility isn't exactly higher, it's on the same level, but it's not lower. So despite the fact that you have less wealth, your utility is not lower.
Sure, I'm understanding, but like with the past example, point E would be the $300 that you pay for premium. C would be the 250. And what would be T?
Those would both be 250. Yeah, in terms of the wealth. But we haven't gotten into measuring utility yet. So they would have the same wealth value of 250, but then the utility of that wealth would be different. But then A would be, what did he have in the beginning? Well, if we're looking at it in terms of total wealth, did we say what his total wealth was to start out with? No, right? Okay, so this would be the full wealth minus 250, the full wealth minus 300, then the full wealth minus 1,000. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Okay, so we're gonna do another willingness to pay example and like plot it out on that graph too. So let's say this guy, Connor, this is my nephew's name. I just have to come up with names. And he's like 2, so so Connor has $10,000 in total wealth. And he has a 25% chance of getting sick. If he does, it'll cost him $7,000 for real this time, 7,000. Now, let's say that his utility takes the form of the U of W is equal to the square root of W. Okay, the utility of wealth equals the square root of wealth. This is a good kind of like, people often use either the square root or the natural log of something because, you know, like a quadratic kind of increases exponentially, but the square root does the opposite. So it gives it a good shape. Okay, so the utility of wealth is equal to the square root of wealth. So first of all, what's the average loss? Yeah.
was 7,000.
Yeah, so 0.25 times 7,000. It's what? You did that in your head? Yeah, 1750. Okay, so the average loss is 1750. Average wealth. You can do the average wealth either by just doing total wealth minus the average loss, or you can do it the same way as the other one. You don't need to know this, but you can also just do like, 0.25 times what's their wealth if they lose the full thing, or 0.75 times what's their wealth if they lose nothing. It'll come out the same, or you can just do wealth minus average loss. So wealth minus average loss, it's I believe you. Yeah, 8,250. Okay. Now, the utility of average wealth. And this would be the point with certainty, right? Point C. So the utility of average wealth. There's no uncertainty involved here. It's like, what would be his utility if he had this amount of money with certainty? Of 8250.
Average wealth that we found like as the second point we calculated, or
Yes,
okay.
because it's correct. So the utility of average wealth, because
That's like what you have lost. So it's what we just calculated.
it's kind of like the actuarial value of his utility. So it's 90.83. It's literally just the square root of 8250. It's 90.83. Oh, really? Let me see. 0.25 times.
No, you're right.
No,
It's 8250. 8250. So it's 90.83. And now the average utility under conditions of uncertainty. So under conditions of uncertainty, we have to have the gamble. So there has to be some probability with one state and some other probability in another state. So basically, this person has a 25% chance of being in a situation where he loses the full thing. In that situation, what would be his remaining wealth? Correct. So now he has a 25% chance of having a wealth of 3,000. So his utility in that situation would be the square root of 3,000. And I really wish I had it. Yeah, I just can't believe there's no dry erase markers, but okay. So
Yeah, I think that down there. That one is okay.
What if I can write it on a piece of paper? Somebody have a pen? Oh, yeah. Okay, so first of all, we have the average loss. We had that. All right, so well, we can just move on. We'll do the utility of the average utility under conditions of uncertainty, right? So now we have a 25% chance of losing everything, in which case this person would have 10,000 minus 7,000 equals $3,000. So under that situation, their utility would be the square root of $3,000, right? Okay, and then they have another possibility, which would be a 75% chance of losing nothing. In that situation, their utility would be the utility of $10,000. So the square root of 10,000. Right? So it works out that when you calculate this, so let's do that. Let's calculate that. Square root of 10,000 times 0.75. Yeah, because these are two potential scenarios. A 25% chance of having the utility of losing everything and a 75% chance of having the utility of losing nothing. Oh, sorry, I think I see now. Yeah. Those are going to be written down, right? Those are. Yeah. I mean, you have the notes. I think it's in the notes. So, oh, let me make sure that. Okay, so we have a 25% chance of losing everything, which would be, well, let me. So in the situation where they lose everything, they have $3,000, 3,000. There's the square root, 54.77. Okay, now this happens with a 25% probability. So 3.42. And then, you know, we have the flip side of it. There's a possibility that you lose nothing. So 10,000, the square root of that, times 0.75. You have a 75% chance of that. It's 75. So now their utility is going to be the sum of 75 plus 3.42. So it's 78.42.
Well, I think
What?
it's times 13.6. Because you did the probability 2 times.
3,000, right? 10,000 minus 7,000 is 3,000. The square root of it is that. Oh, times 0.25. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Okay, 13.69. Okay, all right. So does everybody see how that came about? How to get to 13.69? All right, so it's just 25% times the square root of 3,000 because you need to figure out what's the utility in one scenario and the probability of that happening, plus the utility in the other scenario times the probability of that happening. So on the flip side, we have a 75% chance of 10,000. Here's the square root times 0.75. Oh. Okay, and I don't know, that also didn't work. But anyway, the square root of 10,000 is 100. 100 times 0.75 is 75. So 75 plus 13.69 is 88.69. Okay, so even though these two things have the same actuarially fair, like they're an actuarially fair bet, they're both dealing with this 25% chance of losing $7,000. Regardless, when you split the utilities up and multiply them by their probabilities of happening, the utility comes out lower when you have that. And so that's like reflecting the fact that people don't like the uncertainty. So like mathematically, it ends up working out that way. And so anyway, we have here's 88.69 instead of 90.83. So 88.69 would be like this point D. The same actuarially fair bet, the same amount of probability and loss, but the utility is lower at 88.69 than the other one, 90.3. Yeah, so that's point C and point D. All right, so now we have the next level. Yeah.
So I guess I'm wondering what that number, like the.
It doesn't mean anything. Yeah. So they have no unit. They're not measured in dollars. They're like utils. So the very concept of utility is just like an implied thing. It's mostly just to represent like what's preferential to another thing. Largely, yeah. But the number itself isn't what like means much. Although you can do this and kind of reconvert it. So this is what we're about to do is like kind of like reconvert it back into dollars. But the number 88 itself, nothing. But what we can do is plug that 88 back into the same utility function and figure out like, so what amount of certain dollars does that imply? You know, because we know that like these dollars with uncertainty gives you this lower utility, but that same level of utility would imply what amount of certain dollars, you know, which is kind of like how we get to that point E. Okay, so if we know that the utility of W is equal to the square root of W, we can plug 88.69 back in. So 88.69 equals the square root of something, which is W, right? And now we just square both sides, and then we can figure out how many certain dollars it's equivalent to. So 786592. Okay, so the uncertain bet with an average wealth of 8250 provides the same utility as having 7865 with certainty, right? You're willing to take fewer dollars if you can have those dollars with certainty, and that's the dollar difference that you're willing to pay. So the consumer is willing to pay in total $2,134 because that's point E, right? It includes both their loss and their risk premium. It's the amount of dollars that they're willing to have with certainty in order to completely avoid that potential financial loss of their medical expenditure. So that incorporates both the potential expenditure and the risk premium over and above that. So we know that point E represents their total willingness to pay, and the difference between just what you have in total and your willingness to pay, I mean, and your you know, certain consumption equivalent. I want to go back to the picture. Okay, so we were here at point E. This is the amount of utility that you are willing to have with certainty. You know, the amount of wealth that you're willing to have with certainty, that would be the trade-off, right? So the difference between from here all the way to here, it includes both their average loss and what they're willing to pay above that because of the utility situation. So okay, so they're willing to pay up to $2,000. The average loss was only $1,750. So we know that the risk premium is equal to $384. Okay, so let's stop there. Any questions, or just want to like think that out loud? Think about that.
I'm just thinking of one thing. I don't know if it makes sense, but it's like a criticism to this, or like a perspective of like at the end, like this risk premium, it's basically the profit of like an insurance, and it's like, of course, invented by economists, but in reality, no one knows, like, at least consumers, like, I can bet that 99% of consumers don't know, like, how much they are betting on that risk premium. So I feel like this theory is invented in a way to like say like, oh well, people are willing to pay a little bit more of their natural, their value. But
Right.
it's just like, from
No, like when consumers are purchasing insurance, like they're not necessarily thinking about, okay, well, here's how much I'm probably going to actually have to spend if it was on my own versus, how much more than that am I willing to pay for insurance? I think they're really just like, what can I afford and who's in my network and that kind of thing. But, if we took this outside of the context of health insurance and we were trying to think about, how do markets for car insurance or fire insurance operate, it might make sense, just in terms of like a model for like how things work. Like some people are willing to pay a certain price, people are not willing to pay another price. How do they make those trade-offs in their own minds? At a general level, this is a pretty good illustration of like what are the forces that are operating. But when we try to apply it to health insurance, it's very complicated by the fact that people just want to get coverage, like to get healthcare and to get to see a doctor. So it's, in terms of just financial protection against uncertain medical losses, it's not a perfect, description of what's actually happening. But if there is a market where people are actually just trying to get financial protection against uncertain losses, it's a great model of what's happening,
it makes sense. It's not that it doesn't make sense, and I love it. I love the math inside of it.
Yeah.
I like it a lot.
Me too.
It's just like this.
Yeah.
Thing that is why
are we even doing this? Yeah.
There's many other countries that don't need to learn this.
Yeah. Yeah.
With our system.
It doesn't make any sense. Yeah.
When you were discussing or like talking about how if it would be a good model if it like actually just covered like if something happens, would that be something similar to like liability insurance? Like when you get into a car accident, like you're not really paying for like maintenance per se,
Right.
but you're paying for like if I get into an accident and at least covers like what I'm liable for.
Yes. Yeah, because the liability insurance is truly random. Like you really don't know. There's some probability of it happening. And there's somebody at the insurance company who has worked that out. What's the probability of that happening? And, you got to pay that and they charge a little bit more. And well, I guess with liability insurance, you have to buy it, I think, right?
I think
legally.
I know a lot of like, because I'm originally from California, so I know in California you have to have at least liability insurance, like you have to be insured to be a driver. But most of California is like driving culture, so like I think that's probably just because you're more likely to get into an accident because you're literally driving hundreds of miles a day. So I don't know what it's like.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking like in terms of the fact that you legally have to purchase insurance, there is not necessarily the exact same kind of trade-off of like, okay, how much of this am I willing to pay over and above my potential loss? Like you have to do it regardless. But, if you think about even fire insurance in California, not a good example, but, like home insurance or flood insurance or something, it's, how much it would cost you to rebuild after a flood, or you could approximate, and you would ideally not want to be in that situation. You know how likely floods are in your area. So when you're purchasing insurance, if they're going to charge you, $50,000 a year, then it's like, well, I could probably just rebuild at that point because floods aren't even that likely, and then it's like, okay, maybe they'll charge you $1,000 a year. Then it's like, all right, I mean, it must be more than my probability times my loss because otherwise they wouldn't offer that price. And, I'm willing to like take that trade-off. So in those types of situations, whereas like in flood insurance, it's not like something that happens a little bit, it's not like, oh, I just want to go like get a preventive flood checkup or whatever. None of that's happening. It's really just protection against uncertainty. So the models make sense in some instances, just not this.
I wonder how much of it too is like the thought of losing something like a large sum of money all at once versus losing it like a little bit over time. Just
Absolutely.
Because, like, it sounds like lost $10,000, like I have that probability of losing $10,000, like to most people, $10,000 is a lot of money to lose at one time. But if you can like lose it slowly over time, it feels like less impactful.
Absolutely, because each of your like situation, you know, like especially when you're thinking about an insurance contract over a given year, you know, even if you're buying insurance 10 years in a row and spending $1,000 each year, it doesn't make that much of an impact. You know, if you think about like the utility of wealth, you know, you're going a little bit down every year. That's fine, but you'll never experience a situation where you've lost it all and you're having difficulty consuming, you know, basic goods. Okay, so there's gonna be, we're gonna like just read more and stuff, and you'll have more homework questions where you'll have to do this one more time. But I just kind of want to know if people are understanding which letters are what, you know. But if you also just need to kind of sit with it. Yeah, just forget it. All right, so we're gonna add that final wrinkle, then we're gonna take a break. Okay. The final wrinkle is just the fact that you're not the only person in your insurance pool. So your actuarial loss might not equal another person's actuarial loss, but you all pay the same premium. So the overall insurance premium is based on everybody's actuarial loss. So a healthier person sharing a pool with a sicker person might end up having to pay a higher premium. So the expected loss for the pool is going to be equal to the average of the losses for each individual person, right? Okay, so example, let's say that another person has a chronic condition. They have a 50% chance of incurring a $20,000 hospitalization. What is that individual's average loss? 10,000. Okay. So if this person and Connor shared an insurance pool, what would be their expected loss? Because you added the two together, but it should be the average.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, you would run it for one, run it for the other, and then get the average of the two numbers. So in this case, it would be $1,750 plus $10,000 divided by 2. So the average loss comes out to $5,875. It's just the average loss. Okay, so now would Connor be willing to buy into that insurance policy? No, he wouldn't, because it exceeds his total willingness to pay. And so that's when you get the whole, the healthy people dropping out of the pool. Is the idea of the death spiral of insurance that can happen. It's because so it's this concept of adverse selection. When the insurance pool becomes adversely selected, meaning there's a disproportionate share of like sicker people in a pool. And it's when different people are purchasing this insurance to cover different levels of healthcare needs. It can happen to any sample. So for example, used car sales, you could have an adverse selection situation. You don't really have that much information about the used car as the used car purchaser. So you're going in to buy it, you kind of have to take their word for it, but you're not going to pay the full value. You're going to pay a little bit like less, like you're not willing to pay that premium price on this kind of like unknown quantity of a car. So that means that you, the seller, can't get the full value of that car if you're just selling it on Craigslist or whatever, because no one trusts you. But you have a good car, then you're not going to be willing to sell because they're going to give you a price that's less than what it's worth. So the good cars exit the market. People who have better than average cars are less interested in selling them on the unknown market, which means the only ones left are worse cars. So now consumers, knowing that most of the cars being sold are worse than average, then they become willing to pay even less and less and less until only the really bad cars are left in the market. There's a George Akerlof, he wrote a Nobel Prize paper about this, the market for lemons. And so the market becomes adversely selected, right? Actually, this is kind of like adverse retention because they're only retaining the worst cars. So there's a good example. The thing is about adverse selection, stuff like moral hazard, which we'll talk about next week, that happens a lot and it happens everywhere. Adverse selection is something that, like, we talked about a lot when it came to the ACA insurance markets, for example. Everyone was like so afraid of these death spirals. It's actually kind of not that common to see it arise in nature. It's a lot more common when it comes to people trying to play games like hospitals trying to cherry pick patients. Because of the risk-based payments that they get from Medicare, or because of quality reporting, things like that. So they don't want to be adversely selected. And you also see it with insurance companies wanting to get the healthier than average patients. So they engage in practices to try to make sure that their patient population is not adversely selected. But in terms of causing an insurance pool to unravel, that's usually a level of adverse selection. It's just not, we don't see it all the time, but it's a great example of what can happen with these different forces at play. Okay, so what happened in this example is that at Harvard, they decided to move, as an employer, they decided to move to a system of a defined contribution. Basically, they were like, we'll give you X amount of money. You can either get the cheaper policy, we'll pay for the whole thing, or you can get the more expensive policy, but you have to pay the difference. And so, the PPO, Preferred Provider Organization, had the more generous coverage, the HMO, the Health Maintenance Organization, much more restricted network. So year one, they implement this policy. They have the HMO premium costs you nothing, but if you opt up to the PPO, you pay $381. And about 18% of the employees were willing to do that. Then year two, the healthier consumers exit the PPO and sign up for the HMO in the following year. And by year two, the PPO premium goes up to $741. Those who stayed in the PPO were less, they were older, right? So they were less likely to be under the age of 40, the stayers, as opposed to the leavers. And they also had on average about 6% more overall healthcare spending. So the population was just consuming more care. They were the people who really wanted that generous coverage because they were going to use it. Now, by year three, the premium goes to $1,400. They're even less likely to be under the age of 40, and they have 9% greater healthcare spending. So each time it gets more and more adversely selected. By 1997, they stopped offering the PPO because the premiums were just getting out of control. So they were no longer able to offer this wide network generous coverage, even for people who might have wanted that option. So it's a market failure. Adverse selection causes a market failure, which is a situation where the market is simply not capable of offering some good that consumers actually would want to consume. And so there's this chain of things that happens and how adverse selection causes market failure. We have sicker people that sign up for the more generous policy. Healthier people pay more than their expected loss and more than their total willingness to pay. So the healthier people drop out and the generous policy is adversely selected and it can no longer be offered. We don't want adverse selection. We don't want market failure. So we have policy goals. One is just having a functioning market. And another one at the same time, we want to prevent discrimination from insurance consumers based on their health status. These goals are kind of in conflict. Any guesses why?
Races where people with ages have more consumption and the actuarial value when they calculate it. So it's hard to have an efficient functioning market without discrimination.
Yeah.
For example, I know that in car insurances, I think men are more riskier, so their insurance policies are higher.
Yeah, before the ACA, they used to charge women more for health insurance. Women on average utilize more services for a variety of reasons. And But the ACA didn't want insurance companies to charge people different based on any of these characteristics, and definitely not based on pre-existing conditions. It was a super popular, clause of the ACA, is that no denials for pre-existing conditions and no upcharging for pre-existing conditions. But that is kind of related to the potential for adverse selection because of the way that it affects the overall, actuarial loss of the pool. So we could let insurance companies charge sick people more, but we don't want to do this. Really not a solution. So so the ACA prohibits individual level premium changes, like so risk rating. They can't rate the premium based on risk. And so they have like community rated premiums, but it's actually partially community rated because they let them have the 3-to-1, and so age from the oldest to the youngest can be up to a factor of 3-to-1 in terms of the difference in the premiums. And tobacco use can be of 1.5x premium. Not every state does it. I think New York has decided not to. Medicare Advantage plans, the federal government pays on behalf of the beneficiary. Those are community rated plans. So that's addressing this part of it. The fact that healthier people paying more than the expected loss. It just evens it out a little bit so that your premium reflects your own expected loss a little bit more closely. And then also the ACA requires people to get insurance coverage. It only applies if your income was high enough. And then also they actually reduced the penalty to exactly $0. So there's no real binding penalty anymore. They ended it in 2017. But what we found was that just the existence of the mandate, even without the $0 premium, kind of like just got people in that mindset of I'm supposed to have insurance. Anyway, people reacted to it. Even when the ACA first passed and was implemented, the premium or the mandate penalty was only like $95. It's much cheaper than buying insurance. But nevertheless, you see a pretty big reaction to the mandate. So this is in Massachusetts. You know how the ACA was modeled after Romney Care. So it was happening a little bit earlier. Here's where the mandate gets fully implemented. And, the chronically ill, they're reacting to it. You see a little bit of a spike in their enrollment after the mandate is implemented, but they have other reasons to get insurance. Like they need access to healthcare. It's the people who have no chronic condition diagnosis that really react to this mandate. So, so the individual mandate addresses that part of the chain. And finally, insurance companies, when they're thinking about adverse selection, their incentive is that they want to have low premiums, just low enough that they can beat their competitor so they can get more market share, but they still want healthier patients in their pool so that they can keep the rest. Like if they charge like $1 less than everybody else, but they don't have to pay anything to any doctors because all their enrollees are like extremely healthy. Best case scenario for an insurance company because you're bringing in all these premiums, you're not spending them. So they don't want expensive patients who are going to lose them money. And when you look at the distribution of medical expenditures in the population, I just pulled this off of the medical expenditure panel survey. There's the vast majority, 80-90% of people are spending not very much. And there's a few people who spend a lot more. Insurance companies really want to avoid like that person and that person, the top 1% especially, but the top 1 or 2%, it can make a huge difference. I mean, ideally, so these insurance companies, they have enough people that chance doesn't really play a factor. The actuarial values end up working out statistically. It's like the law of large numbers kind of thing. But if you have a systematic bias in your sample, that's not something that chance has anything to do with. So you want to try to ideally have systematically biased towards the healthier population, or at the very least, don't be statistically biased in the wrong direction. So what they do is they do cream skimming, have your office on the 5th floor. All of their advertisements have these really healthy people, these Medicare Advantage plans. And it's like, you're selling a product that gives people access to healthcare. You would think that they would have people, in the hospital or something in their ads, but you don't. There are always these super fit young people barely with a couple of grays and just doing all kinds of exercises. So it's part of their tactic to attract the healthiest possible enrollees. And then the other place that you see this on the provider side is hospital reimbursements. Medicare, they do this thing where they withhold payments for 30-day readmission. So if they do some kind of a procedure and you end up getting readmitted within 30 days, that's all coming out of your initial one single payment. The point is to give them the right care the first time around. But there are some patients who are just more likely to be readmitted. Patients in poverty, it's harder to do whatever follow-up treatment is going to be necessary or to make your environment the way that it should be to support health and recovery might not be there for everybody. So they want to avoid those sicker patients because they're going to lose money whenever they end up getting readmitted. And of course, they do try to risk adjust these measures, but even the risk adjustments themselves can be gamed. So let's say they're going to increase the payment for a person who has a diagnosis of diabetes, which then best case scenario for the hospital is going to be get a person who has a diabetes diagnosis, but is really healthy. So no comorbidities, really up to date on their foot check, whatever it is, so that you get that extra bump from the diabetes, but you don't actually have much likelihood of needing to pay for their follow-up care. So even the risk adjustment, they have it, but it's not very good. And in itself, it can be gamed. It's part of the game. Yeah, so that's why we engage in risk adjustments for all these different kinds of measures. But it's hard to do it right. And safety net providers can lose out because they end up being adversely selected. Yeah, so this is an actual test question from a health economics course in New Zealand. We have a bank of test questions through IHEA, the International Health Economic Association, where we can share test questions. And yeah, this was one of the ones from New Zealand. Why do private health insurance markets tend to fail? Moral hazard, diseconomies of scale with respect to administrative costs, i.e. natural monopoly of the insurance company. C, adverse selection, or D, all of the above. I think the answer was D.
All of them, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of a challenge when it comes to just having a well-functioning insurance market. I think that's it. So let's take a break here and then we'll come back and talk about the reading. So 7:43.
I have a question. So, like I mentioned before, I'm from California. I think the biggest, I would say, insurer there is Kaiser Permanente. And I wonder how, what we just talked about around, adverse selection. I mean, their big thing now is, free preventative care, which I think is kind of smart.
ACA does too, yeah.
Yeah, because it's you don't have to pay for a checkup, so more people are going to get their checkups and I would assume would be healthier long term. And so I wonder how that plays into kind of adverse selection and maybe trying to kind of shift it away from that. If you're having to take in patients of all kinds, do you see some of that preventative care, free preventative care work as a way to maybe make people healthier to a certain degree?
Yeah, I mean, so the ACA requires at least one preventive visit or checkup included each year, with no patient cost sharing. And they have a list of things from the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force that they define as preventive care that all insurers have to provide free of charge. And I think that that's just a way of carving something out just to make sure that people are getting access to care. It's hard because a lot of the benefits of these preventive measures play out over a really long period of time. Yeah. They might not be with that same insurer, even, because you're signing a contract for a 1-year period. And 10 years from now, who knows where you'll live or what insurance you'll have or anything. So there's not much of an incentive from the insurance company's perspective to actually invest in long-term health. Some of it's marketing.
Yeah, I would say that's like great marketing. Like, I was like, that's genius. Cause it's like, for people, it's like, oh, like I'm getting like a free
Oh, they really care.
checkup. Yeah, they care. And I'm like, no, they don't. It just helps them in the long run. Cause it's like, you're healthier and they don't have to pay you. They don't have to pay.
It doesn't. It probably doesn't help them in the long run.
No, you don't think so?
Uh,
Oh,
it's,
I guess you said it's like
it's
sometimes
almost
it's short
impossible
term.
to
Yeah,
quantify what that may or may not be.
yeah.
So I doubt that they're banking on much of it for help. I just doubt that they're really giving that much outside of what's required by law.
Yeah, yeah. It's great marketing though.
Yeah.
I mean, I like private permanente. Like, of all the insurance I've had, I just like their one-stop shop model. But a lot of people don't like it because you don't get the choice. But I like just being able to go to one place, get my eyes checked, get a doctor, go to the pharmacy. It's great. I love it. But I'm also like young, relatively healthy. I go to the doctor.
You don't need a bunch of different specialists. Yeah, you know, Henry J. Kaiser, he was a shipping magnate in World War II. And then he was giving his employees insurance, and then he figured, well, now that the war is over, I guess I'll just do this.
Actually grew up in the town that was in. So we learned the whole history. Montana, California. Yeah. But I was like, oh, okay. I actually went to Henry J. Kaiser High School.
Wow. That's crazy. I'm gonna put a reminder in my phone so that next week I bring a dry erase marker.
There is one somewhere, just in a secret place.
I feel
Right.
like I
Like
saw
that bench
one.
opens up and well,
It's all like Post-its,
Yeah.
pens. It's like office.
yeah,
Staples.
moves everything you need.
I think I saw a red one. I feel like I saw a red one, but I might have literally not.
I don't want to say that's possible, but I've done that.
Yeah, we have a call for intervention.
Just in time to present that SWOT analysis.
I was like, I've only done it for like power mapping, like organizing.
I also just feel like lately, no matter what I do, if it's like teaching or studying, like I'll do it on a Monday, right? And then by Tuesday, I'm like, what are my assignments? What did I just do? Like I'm looking at the homework thing, which I did yesterday, and I don't remember writing it.
Oh, I feel that.
I'm like burnout recovery. I just feel like my brain's.
Yeah, I feel that.
Yeah, I'm like looking at this, I'm like, I wrote this down. No way.
You're like, wow, I got smart.
That's not smart, but I mean, it's the wrong answer, but like I sound.
Well, you don't know. It
Yeah.
might be the right.
I see in the homework what I did wrong.
Yeah, I'm like, I think I definitely did the math wrong, because I think mine were like the one that's supposed to be smaller was.
Yeah, I, for 7 and 8A, where you were supposed to take square root, I took the exponent.
Oh, like squared it.
So, yeah, I knew when I was writing, I was like, 900 million seems like a lot. But now I know it definitely is a lot. That was wrong. Not correct. That's okay.
Yeah, you gotta know, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
definitely get it down. Well, I also just feel like I'm stumbling through the homework, like trying to pull from information, and then I get to class, I'm like, oh, dang, I'm a dummy. Like,
No, but the thing is that I feel like the homework, it just like forces you to engage with the work.
Yeah.
So then when I teach it to you, it's a lot easier for me.
Well, it also helps because we were talking earlier too, like, in doing it, made me realize that I didn't understand it as well as I thought I did when I was in class, and when I was like reading the textbook. So I was like, oh, this is how the homework. I was
See, I
like,
feel like I have the opposite experience, is that I do the reading and I'm like extremely confused and do the homework, and then I come to class, I'm like, oh, that's what that meant there.
I did this, I was on a board for something and they gave us, a 10-minute break, or sometimes they would do like 2 5-minute breaks or something. And then somebody mentioned though, that like, it's important for some people to like have a full 10-minute break, like people might have like mobility issues or disabilities, or they need to deal with something with their family or whatever, it's like, just give at least one opportunity to get a full 10 minutes of like non-instruction. So yeah, that like stuck with me, I guess.
I've been sitting for hours.
Try to implement like a 10-minute break in a lecture and like, okay, so this is gonna be the assignment when you guys come back and nobody takes the break, they just start working on it. So I feel like I get, don't show it to them. I thought that, for someone that didn't have to go to the bathroom, it was like a minute to start, but they all just start going into it, so I'm like,
Yeah,
okay.
because their thinking is probably like, if we finish early, if we let us stop early.
It never happens. I always think I'm not gonna have
Yeah.
enough. I'm like, oh, I'm never gonna fill this space, and then I'm like. punching it.
Oh, yeah, that happened to me too. When I was teaching that same class, I was like, oh, I don't know how I'm gonna fill all this time. And then by the end, I was like, okay, we gotta wrap it up. Just like panicking. Sorry, you only have 7 minutes to talk to your group. I'll try to do better next time. Yeah. And it just never happens.
No, never. It's crazy. I don't think I can fill almost 2 hours, but I could talk forever, honestly.
Well, and also like,
Apparently.
it also depends too on like the discussion, like with students, between themselves, and with you, and like the
Yeah.
entire class. Because sometimes students get really weird. I love, and I'm like, oh, I'm gonna talk.
I'm also finding like there's a lot of tangents, which is
Yeah.
great, but then I have to recenter, which is not my strong suit. Of like, thank you so much for that. The thing I needed was what?
Yeah.
You're like, where did we?
But sometimes, oh, sorry.
It's empty.
Oh,
It's really empty.
sometimes I'll like I'll be like, okay, that was great. Where were we though? Like, and I'm like, sorry.
How did that connect?
Yeah.
How did we go? How did we get there? People are like, oh, look here, and I'm like, thank you so much. Yeah, I've already been like, sorry, I'm 2 years into my COVID fog, so I have this little checklist of notes, because otherwise I will.
Oh, yeah, totally.
It's true though, I feel like if I don't have if I start talking about something else, and I'm like, where was I? What's
Yeah,
happening?
there's always one student that can keep track. So if I really lose it, I'm like, where were we? I'm sorry.
I know, it's a net, she sits right in that corner, she's on top of it.
Yeah.
Teacher's pen, I love it.
And I'm like, thank you.
Okay, so 10 minutes. All right, so I just wanted to talk about the reading that we had, the New Yorker article especially. So Malcolm Gladwell talks about this, like the Nyman versus the Pauli camps. So when I was doing my Master of Public Health, and we had a section in our textbook about like Pauli versus Nyman, and it actually, that debate itself was like the reason why I decided to get a PhD in economics, like health economics, because I was just like, and my dissertation, it kind of answers them. But, just because like, I just felt like they were both wrong, in a particular way. Like Pauli is wrong in this like obvious way to me. I mean, well, in a way that Malcolm Gladwell does a good job of making obvious, kind of like drawing out the problem with the risk aversion as a model for demand for healthcare, especially when in the face of moral hazard. And then Nyman posits that insurance is an income transfer. And then that sounds nice, but empirically, when we look at it, then does vary by income, but not by that much. So if it really was purely an income transfer, then we would expect people, just because, so somebody who has 50,000 in income versus 100,000 and 150,000 or $1 million, they have different levels of healthcare consumption, but like not by that much. And yet when you get insurance, you consume a lot more healthcare. So if the difference between the two could really be best understood as a difference in income, we would expect a much smaller difference in the medical care consumption. But it's kind of like income-induced consumption is totally different from insurance-induced consumption. So empirically speaking, like Nyman it sucks, but it's just not really pointed out. Even though I'm like, good try. Like, I really appreciate it. But anyway, it's super complex and it's something that's still playing out all the time in the academic literature. Even like I went to one of the meetings of the American Society of Health Economists, and Mark Pauly was the president. He was the outgoing president, so he was like giving the lunchtime keynote. And I forget exactly what it was that he was talking about, but he said something XYZ, and then he was like, "Take that, Nyman." And it's like, dude, this happened like, I mean, so I was at this meeting in like 2014 or something, and these debates had happened like 20 years previously. But I think that, even for this person who is like Mark Pauly's dissertation in 1965 basically is the Affordable Care Act in a lot of ways. The income-based subsidies, the way that the different tiers would work, all that stuff, he sketched it out in his dissertation. And he kind of ended up architecting, American healthcare policy today. But he's still just like mad at Nyman, which I love. Anyway, so what did you guys think about, because I kind of want to know, I think when I read that Malcolm Gladwell article, I come to it from a perspective of like having investigated some of these issues for a long time. So I'm just curious, like what people or like, what jumps out at you about the argument for like in favor of kind of Pauly and the moral hazard view of insurance versus the other one.
I'll have to say that the article itself actually explained moral hazard better than when I took my health economics course in my master's program. Because I was like, what does that even mean? What are you talking about? Like moral hazard, I don't understand. And I feel like just saying like, oh, it impacts your behavior and the way that you consume like insurance. And so I think that for me really stuck out because I was like, oh, that's pretty clear. Like they lay it out, I like literally highlighted it. So it made it more clear.
What did he say? Like the
He
highlight?
just says moral hazard is the term economists use to describe the fact that insurance can change the behavior of the person insured.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I was like, okay, that kind of makes sense. And then I think it's the third, oh no, it's 1, 2. The 5th page at the bottom paragraph. He talks about 9 minutes talk is saying that when your insurance company requires you to make a $20 co-payment, it's not that they want you to take a larger share, but it's to make your healthcare more efficient. Like the way that you consume it more efficient. And my assumption is that because you have to pay more, you use less, right? So that kind of makes sense. Because it's like, from like a personal perspective, like my mom will really, like she has a lot of health issues, but she'll like use her insurance, I guess, more efficiently. But on the flip side, sometimes she won't go to the doctor because she has to pay a copay. Or the copay increases based on like if it's a specialist or like her PCP. So then on the flip side, I was kind of like, well, who does it benefit? Like, is it more efficiency for the benefit of insurers or like people being insured?
Right.
That was kind of like the question that got brought up for me is like, from what perspective are we having this discussion or this discourse?
I think that the argument in favor of efficiency is kind of like from the perspective of the social planner. And in theory, ultimately, it's supposed to benefit the enrollee themselves as well. So if, from the perspective of just the economist and looking at like, okay, are we producing the right things in the right quantities that everybody wants and values? If people are changing, if they're like consuming a good, not because their marginal benefit equals the, price, but because their insurance has kind of artificially changed the equation, kind of artificially lowered the price. So now they're consuming at a point where marginal benefit does not equal marginal price. In fact, their benefit is probably lower than the real price to society of producing that unit of healthcare expenditure. So that's an inefficient quantity of medical care consumption. That's the idea, is that in terms of like, if behind the veil, so if just being the social planner, you don't know which individual you are, you ideally want to have the most efficient possible use of society's resources. So you don't want to be producing something that people don't even really demand, doesn't really benefit them. And ultimately, in theory, it's supposed to also benefit the individual consumer, like enrollee, because if your insurance premium is the average loss of the pool, you don't want everybody consuming a whole bunch of healthcare, because ultimately it's going to raise everyone's premiums. That's the idea. But then it's also like, I think for me personally, if price doesn't really represent value, then, like if we can just negotiate down drug prices like they were talking about in the finance committee, then, maybe that's the problem. Maybe prices have gotten out of whack and they don't actually reflect the value to society. So the fact that marginal benefit is lower than this totally random number that they came up and decided was the price, maybe that's okay. We need to lower prices so that people can consume, to an extent that they actually want to. So, so the problem from the perspective of moral hazard is that insurance artificially lowers the price. And that's why we have to expose people to price through things like cost sharing, so that they feel the real cost to society a little bit better. But the other way to look at it is that it's not that insurance artificially lowers price, it's that other things in the market have artificially inflated the price, and we need to deal with that by lowering prices. Other thoughts? What did people think about Nyman too? I'm kind of curious. I know I gave my own thoughts, so I might have biased the conversation, but yeah, just what came up.
That's something that stood out to me was with the report of the president in 2004, like the economic report. Maybe not directly to him, but like what was mentioned about like people don't want to consume insurance. Like I don't have it right here right now, but it was like something around like people decide to be uninsured, and people like, and also the concept of like overconsumption of health. Like what is that? Like we don't talk about like overconsumption of medication or overconsumption of anything else. And I think that mindset is around like people just like, we have a public insurance for everyone, like free healthcare, then everyone's going to start using a lot and we're going to lose a lot of money. And of course, that's not going to happen. We have like many examples where that doesn't happen. If like public insurance come, like maybe people at first like use a lot, but then it's going to go down for sure. Like that's what has happened in other countries. So it's just like this mindset of like overconsumption that we have here is like what keeps bringing out like we need insurance companies, we need people to have insurance, and that's something that stayed in my mind out of the moral hazard.
Yeah, this idea of overconsumption. I think that I feel like it's kind of like fallen out of favor because more and more like, and as the prices of healthcare have just like gone up, and people are just report that they lack, that they had to forego or delay care due to its price at pretty high rates, some 40% within any given year of people that say that they had to forego or delay some form of either prescription or some kind of help. So the idea of overconsumption was more of a problem like before the advent of the high deductible health insurance plans, which they really came about in the past like 15 years. Like they just in the past 15 years, high deductible insurance has really taken off. And it was driven by that argument of overconsumption and as with high deductibles as a solution. So the consumer-directed health plan with coupled with the health savings account. And today it's almost like hard to distinguish between a high deductible health plan and just a regular health plan. They tend to be like the regular health plan has a higher deductible than what it used to be with the high deductible plan. So they've both just risen. And I think that as deductibles and cost sharing have proliferated, we stopped talking about this idea of overconsumption, and now it feels kind of alien. And I think also probably because of people who look at access, try to measure and understand that. So they're kind of at odds with each other, the concept of like access and barriers and the concept of the overconsumption of premium.
So what you mentioned is that overconsumption is not like something that is debated right now
No.
after the high
This is-
deductible plans and like the ACA has changed, right?
Yeah, not just under the ACA, it started before the ACA. Because employer-sponsored plans are still the majority of the market, and those plans have high deductibles too. But yeah, I don't hear a lot about overconsumption as like a problem that policy needs to address. Oh, yeah, we still have high health expenses.
I think I lost the plot a little once Sergio was talking and thought about it, but I feel like I kind of struggle with this concept of moral hazard. Like he says, 9 months this year is like the lack of enthusiasm for healthcare insurance. I'm just like, I think I'm struggling with the idea of adding patient barriers to healthcare, like coming from a public health background in theory, and like how public health econ like is focused on kind of like cost sharing and adding barriers to access.
Right.
It feels like, and I feel like those conflict.
Yeah, I mean, so probably a lot of health economists who are housed in the School of Public Health, you know, when you finish your PhD and you go out on the job market, you apply for a bunch of different jobs. Some people, usually people who have a PhD in economics, they end up in a department of economics where their main thing is about markets, not necessarily about consumers and having access and public and this kind of thing. And then some people end up in a School of Public Health. They're probably people who are concerned with the things that you're talking about. But we all contribute to the same, you know, academic journals, and it's the same discipline, the same field for the most part. But so think about, so number one thing that they will say, and next week, actually, this is maybe a good segue, but next week we're going to talk about moral hazard very specifically and like take that concept apart. But the thing is like, okay, so if you're thinking about it as a consumer of insurance, all you're trying to do is purchase protection against financial uncertainty. So other people coming into this insurance market and just using it to cover their day-to-day bills is going to increase everybody's premiums, right? And it's not just that, it's also the fact that they just want consumers to have skin in the game. That's an actual phrase that they use. So they want consumers to make informed decisions. So imagine, you know, think about like your conference travel budget that maybe somebody gives you. And if they just gave you a totally blank check, maybe you would fly business class and stay in a super nice hotel and eat a really expensive dinners every night. And they want you to go, they want you to get there safely, cleanly, comfortably, go to the conference, eat food and come home. But they also want to put some limit on like your overuse of those otherwise good things. I mean, the fact is that if you have a blank check, there are some situations in which, you know, the marginal dollar you might just end up just using without really thinking about it. So they just want like to have some guardrails in place that prevents like either overly expensive procedures, excessive numbers of tests, kind of just like, oh, I cut my finger, why don't I go ahead and like get stitches as opposed to a Band-Aid, you know? Like going to the emergency department when you could have just put Neosporin. There are other factors that might make you not want to go to an emergency department, like time, travel, just there's other personal costs that also play a factor. But, you know, if economists are thinking about it in terms of, you know, the US, we have all this healthcare, high healthcare spending. Well, we know that it's pretty effective. People react to prices. But the problem with insurance is that there's no price for them to react to. So they're just going to keep on consuming. Well, let's make sure that there's some instrument, some guardrails in place that within the design of insurance benefits, which is maybe, you know, that's my job. I design insurance benefits. So maybe what we need to do is have some guardrails within the design of insurance benefits that slows that down, or at least gives the person a reason to think. And they will always say, people who kind of like espouse this perspective, that you know, income constrained consumers, low income consumers are not part of this equation. they should have access to healthcare, which is why Medicaid has like no out-of-pocket costs, because that's really not even part of it. If you're struggling, if you're in poverty, you need to be able to get your healthcare access. So they kind of like bifurcate the market in that way, conceptually from the economist's perspective. And we see a pretty strong bifurcation in the actual like sources of insurance coverage too, between private and public, where one has a lot of expensive and one is totally free. Anyway, so that's the idea behind that, is that like, all right, we're not talking about low income people. They need to just get free access. Everybody else who has a little bit of money, maybe they should have some reason for pause.
Because it sounds like this model is to account for like public health expenditure, right? To understand like why public health expenditure is so high, and like you're saying, guardrails to it for the individual. But shouldn't there also be like a mechanism of understanding guardrails for like institutional spending? Because would you argue that the institutions are the ones that are spending inefficiently, therefore driving up high expenditures versus the individual's access?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. That's something we get into. Like, I feel like it seems like very, like kind of like what we talk about in the program, like focus on like, oh, like patient planning, you're accessing too much of your healthcare. And I wonder how we kind of addresses like the market system.
Well, like that 30-day readmission thing, that was supposed to be part of it. But one thing that they just won't do is negotiate prices, which might be effective. It would be like just really get a very direct route to dealing with like those costs. But they do try to kind of, still relying on the concept of markets, but just trying to nudge things one way or the other. Yeah, so basically 30-day readmissions, other kinds of like cost bundling, those are the ideas that they have on the supply side. And the thing is about consumers, like, I mean, it makes sense to have guardrails for institutions much more than for consumers, because this isn't their job. What we need for consumers is to be able to efficiently and effectively go through a healthcare, system and get their needs checked and moved on. And then all of the little stuff happening, around trying to improve quality, trying to reduce costs, should be happening on the back end between experts and people whose job it is to make that process really efficient, right? So we could just hire triage people at the door of every emergency department, and that, instead of having $100 copay at the ED, we could have a triage person who could assess the situation and help them to make that decision and make the appointment for you in primary care next week if you really just could wait, that kind of stuff. I mean, yeah, it's like, I can't really explain why they try to push things onto consumers, except that, yeah, it's just the way things are. And it's not right. It's like definitely not right.
So, like, going kind of back to Amanda's, the sentence she brought out around the fear of moral hazard and how it's like, why it's like the reasoning for the general lack of enthusiasm for like national health insurance or expanded Medicare. I wonder how moral hazard plays a role, or if it's even discussed in like other countries that have nationalized healthcare, like Canada or parts of the UK. Does that moral hazard, do economists talk about?
No, economists never talk about any other country. Like,
I mean, like
seriously.
economists in their country, like, do they talk about
Yeah.
moral hazard, and how does that play a role, and how does that compare to like this kind of thinking around like, oh, moral hazard is the reason why we can't have nationalized healthcare?
I think that, so for example, in Japan, where people use a lot of MRIs, and they've just like incentivized people to produce really efficient MRIs that are really cheap to produce, so like maybe they are overutilizing MRIs. You probably don't need like magnetic resistance imaging or whatever it is. Like, it's like a really complex process. Like, and people probably don't need those MRIs all the time, but you can also just incentivize the production of really efficient MRI machines and not, kind of make a problem out of that. I don't really think that they do deal with that. Instead of thinking about it as moral hazard, sometimes what they do is put supply side constraints on like just they simply do not have that many, you know, so I think if in the UK where the medical employees are staff, they're civil servants, right? They're government workers, which is different from Canada where they're private doctors and they bill the Medicare, Canadian Medicare. So in the UK health system gets to decide how many of each type of specialist are we going to have on staff. So that's like a way of kind of addressing moral hazard in a sense, but it's really just rationing healthcare resources. And it's just, these are how many are available. So that's it. You know, and they set that number based really on demand and what's needed in each different region and that kind of thing. But, you know, maybe they just hire more GPs where people might have gone to a specialist, but since there's much more availability with a general practitioner, they'll just go there. You know, so I think that they just don't conceptualize moral hazard in the same way. And they probably use more rationing to address the fact that like consumers consume. Anything from the online folks? You can feel free to chime in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi. So something that stuck out for me was I think it's on page 6 of we're still talking about the New Yorker article. The comment made by Uwe Reinhardt, who I had learned about when I was like an undergrad, because my professor was like obsessed with him.
Yeah, me too.
But I really liked his like critique of it, which is like kind of going back to what we're talking about, like overconsumption of healthcare. Is like people are only going to use up to like the amount of healthcare that they think that they need, and like, you know, given like these like cost benefit analyses that they're doing individually, it really doesn't make sense, and it like kind of goes back to, you know, how healthcare itself, it doesn't really follow those same kinds of you know, market guidelines that a lot of these arguments are built off of.
Yeah, I love Yui Reinhardt. He did we talk about Yui Reinhardt before in this class? I think it might have been master's students, but I went to this one conference. It was like Academy Health. I went to one session of it and they had like a tribute to him right when he died. And at the end, there was this one girl who came up to the mic and she was like, she was 5 years old in 1995 when they implemented the like single payer system in Taiwan. And he was a big part of that. Like he was like an advisor there and his wife is Taiwanese. And anyway, so he like kind of like played a big hand in designing their single payer system. They were kind of like, you know, which one should we do? Like, how should we do it? He was just like, go straight single payer. He's a professor at Princeton. And she said that, you know, when she was 5 in 1995 and they implemented single payer, her family no longer had to choose between rice and medicine. And she was able to go to school. And that's why she decided to get a PhD in health economics. And like, you know, she was like, is like so grateful to Yui Reinhardt for him, for like changing her life. And yeah, super incredible. Yeah, just like what we do has a real human impact. Okay, so I think that's about it. It's 8:09. So I'll see you guys next week. And for the homework you have like that, you'll have to start using one of the answers from previously. So I think that the right answers are in the slides anyway, which I'll put up, but yeah, enjoy.
Thank you.